This is Travel in 10.
Ceci est la voyage dans 10.
This is podcast Reise in 10.
You're listening to Travel in 10. And now, your host, David Brody.
On today's show, we're traveling to Istanbul, Turkey. And for this special edition of Travel in 10, we're joined by a co-host for the broadcast. Christensen is the host of the Amateur Traveler podcast. He's recently traveled to Turkey and is going to be telling us all about it. So come along for the audio ride to Istanbul, Turkey. Thanks very much for joining me today, Chris.
Well, you're welcome. It seemed only fair.
Well, Chris hosts what I think is probably one of the best online travel podcasts out there. I mean, it's certainly one of the most widely subscribed to and widely listened to. And I wonder, how did you get your start podcasting, Chris?
Well, I started podcasting back in 2005, July of 2005, mainly because I fell in love with podcasting as a media and then just tried to figure out what I could bring to that and realized that as we sat around one Labor Day telling stories at a picnic, all the good stories were travel stories.
I mean, it really comes through in your shows that you've got a real passion for traveling.
Yeah.
How is it that you get to do so much traveling? I mean, it seems that a lot of your shows are interviews, but a lot of them are also, your reports from having traveled around the world.
Well, most of them are interviews, to be fair. I travel at best 4 weeks a year because that's how much vacation I get. So now the last year I got a little more traveling than usual, in part because a trip we were going to do the previous year for our 25th wedding anniversary to Panama Canal got postponed a year until my daughter got into college. And then I had some advertising sponsorship on my show last December, and so I used that to pay for a trip to Turkey. And so I had a little more travel than I used to have, but that was, of course, part of the point that I wanted to do the show. I thought it would help me subsidize travel or write it off or whatever. So.
And are you starting to get, I mean, your show certainly, it's always in, one of the top 10 or top 20 on iTunes, and I know you've been talked about in National Geographic. Are you starting to get some interest from the travel industry? Do you have people pitching you on stories and things?
Definitely. What I have gotten more of a reputation with right now, and to be fair, National Geographic Traveler is what has mentioned the show rather than the parent magazine. And what I've had more contact with recently has been authors of travel guides, and that's been a lot of fun for me. I've actually gotten involved in a travel writers group, and they've been a wonderful source of guests on the show because they have literally written the book about the country, and often they've written about a particular country because they're passionate about that country. They served there in the Peace Corps or fell in love with, say, Costa Rica before anybody thought of what's the new Costa Rica, even before they thought of what's the old Costa Rica, back before anybody was going there. So that's been a lot of fun.
Well, and that's one of the things we're hoping to do today is talk about somewhere that I know you're passionate about is the time that you spent over in Turkey. Can you maybe tell everybody a bit about when you first went to Turkey and why you chose Istanbul?
Well, I went to Turkey last February, as I said, because I had got a sponsorship from Sheraton, actually, the few months before that, and said, well, heck, they're paying me money to talk about travel. I'm going to go travel someplace. And went by myself, but went there and met a young student there who used to be our exchange student. He had stayed with us for the better part of a year, a couple of years before that, and had really been dying for us to come see him. So pestering us would be really the appropriate term for that. Really wanted us to come see him. And when you fly into Turkey, it's easier to fly into Istanbul than in any other place. Istanbul or Ankara are really the two places you can fly into. And it just was a wonderful, as somebody who is a huge fan of things historic, Istanbul was just a wonderful place to stop, and I'm so glad I did it and just fell in love with the city.
Absolutely. I mean, it must be a fascinating place. For somebody's first trip there, I mean, what would you say are some of the not-to-be-missed destinations that they should really think about setting some time aside to see? There's
a few obvious places in Istanbul, and then I'd like to name some places that you probably haven't heard of. So most people, when they're going there, have heard of the Blue Mosque, for instance, which isn't really the name of it. Don't call it that. Only the tourists do. It's the Sultanahmet Mosque, which is right opposite the Hagia Sophia now a museum, but formerly a mosque and formerly a basilica in the Eastern Roman Empire built by Justinian. And those two are sort of the center of old Istanbul or old Constantinople before that. And they're just fascinating, beautiful buildings there. The Sultanahmet Mosque, for instance, has 6 minarets, which was scandalous when it was built because the only other mosque in the world that had 6 minarets was in Mecca. And this was somebody who hadn't won any big victories for Islam, Sultan Ahmet, after who it is named. And so it was scandalous that he would try and build this to overshadow Mecca, and they told him they needed to tear down one of the minarets, but wisely he figured out he could just pay to build another one in Mecca. So that's how you see it. But St. Sevier in Kora has some of the best examples of Byzantine mosaics and Byzantine artwork. And it mostly when these churches were converted to mosques originally after the conquest, they plastered over these and accidentally, therefore, preserved them. And so later on, when Ataturk comes in and he makes the Turkish nation a secular nation, a lot of these were then turned into museums, not back into churches, but not into mosques. And they took off the plaster, and you can see these wonderful, wonderful mosaics or these wonderful frescoes and such in these churches. And St. Sevier in Kora has just some stunning frescoes. I covered it in one of the video episodes of The Amateur Traveler. Just really thoroughly love that. And very few tourists get out that way.
And why is that? Just it's tougher to make
a little
it out?
Further out. You have to, hop on a bus, and the tour groups don't necessarily get that far out. It's not that hard to get to if you're willing to do public transportation or just walk for a ways. But it's just not as touristy. Most tourists are in Hagia Sophia, the Sultanahmet Mosque or the Blue Mosque, and the Grand Bazaar, and that may be all they see. May not even get up to the Spice Bazaar or some of the other larger mosques in the area.
Now, it's interesting. I mean, you talked about in one portion, the boutique hotel you stayed at and the nightlife there. I don't think that's things that people normally associate with Istanbul and with Turkey. I mean, they think of more of the historic sites. Did you find it all? I mean, just reading in the news recently, I mean, you always hear about that part of the world and some of the strife that's going on there. I know Turkey just earlier this week had a bit of a border incursion in Iraq with some troops crossing over. I mean, were you ever worried about safety or concerned about that when you were there, or is it really just...
I wasn't. Now, first of all, my tour guides were Turks, and they were friends and such, so I was treated as family. But also, the other thing that I would want you, and I didn't really say it, but especially when you're up in the Beyoğlu is the northern part of the older city, the part that I said is the European part.
Right.
When you're in Beyoğlu, I want you to understand that it feels like a European city. I mean, it is a European city, but you don't feel like you're in a Middle Eastern city. So if your picture of Turkey is, I'm in the Middle East, you've got the wrong mental image. Now, clearly there are mosques instead of cathedrals.
Sure.
But the city feels European to me. It doesn't feel like, when I went to Eastern Turkey, and I went to Urfa, for instance, which is in a Kurdish area, and there were Arabs there also, and there were then women who were wearing more traditional garb and such, that felt different. Or even a little bit as I got to the eastern part of Istanbul and the Asia part of Istanbul, I would see more people in a traditional dress. But when you're in the European part of Istanbul, it feels like Europe.
Sure. And you didn't feel, I mean, like there were any safety precautions that you had to take there that you would take any different than traveling anywhere else in the world, or? No,
not really. I mean, they've had some issues there. There have been some terrorist things. They've been fairly rare in that area. And the one thing that you may not picture, because you may not have heard it on our news, but I've heard the reports of it, for instance, of after some of these things where there are huge demonstrations, for instance, in Ankara, where people who are basically talking about Ataturk, who is the person who made Turkish secular, and just chanting over and over again, Turkish is a secular nation, Turkey is a secular nation. So I don't think people necessarily have a correct picture of Turkey in our country here.
So is that what really surprised you most about going there, or is that what you were expecting going in? I guess having known some people there, you had a bit more background, perhaps.
I had a little more background. I wasn't expecting, though, to be walking down the streets in Beyoğlu and going, wow, this feels so comfortable, so familiar. Oh, and the food is so good. That was probably the biggest surprise. Really enjoyed the food there.
Any one particular dish or restaurant that stands out?
In terms of restaurant, they were just the little restaurants off the way where you'd see the locals eat were just all real good. Try something with the persimmon sauce, and that was really good. And to drink tea everywhere, just little tiny glasses of tea, not cups of tea, and you could sit at a table for hours on end and just have a cup of tea that might cost you 50 cents or something like that. Now, probably a little more different now that the dollar has been plummeting into play money. But it's still relatively inexpensive and very sociable around a cup of tea or a cup of salep, which is a drink that is made from I don't know how to describe it. It has a sort of a cinnamony flavor, almost a little more like eggnog, but that's not quite the right flavor. But that's definitely something to try also. Or just get a simit, which is a type of almost like a pretzel, which they'll sell on the street vendors. It's just a circle, and it's got sesame seeds on it. But just that was, I think, a wonderful surprise.
In terms of costs, I mean, you talked a little bit about that. What do you think sort of the low end and the high end in terms of what someone would need to budget for a trip to Istanbul?
It's going to depend a lot on where you stay. So I did Istanbul on both ends of the trip that I was at. And the first end, the family that I was visiting, my exchange student's host family, both booked and, as it turns out, paid for the hotel room, which was a little bit of a surprise for me. Their generosity was actually very overwhelming. They literally told me to bring an extra suitcase for all the things they wanted to send home with me. But so we stayed in a business-style hotel because Yos, who is our exchange student, his father is a businessman, and when he goes to Istanbul, he goes on business. That was near Taksim, which is a central square and more of a business area. And that was probably $100 to $200 a night, somewhere in that range. Not a really large hotel room, very nice breakfast, good internet connection. When I went back, I booked something through a discount hotel site, and that's where I ended up in this boutique hotel, which I mentioned, the Historica, just very, very close to the historic center, just down from the carpet market and just around the corner from the Sultanahmet Mosque. It was a wonderful location if you like that historic part of Istanbul, and it was, I think, about $50 a night or something like that.
Any sort of last tips for someone thinking of going?
Don't be afraid to go would be probably the biggest thing that I would recommend to people. I really didn't feel uncomfortable at all. Be willing to have a good sense of humor about the people who are trying to sell you a carpet if you don't want one. If you do want one, there's a great carpet salesman who, as I'm coming into the city, when I came back by myself, I actually normally have a wonderful sense of direction, but I managed to get completely turned around looking for this little hotel. I had gotten it pictured wrong in my mind where it was oriented. And so I had to stop twice and ask directions for people. And one of the carpet salesmen, for instance, one of the merchants there who had a carpet shop said, oh, okay, he called up the hotel and said, well, where are you? And he found out where they are. And he walked me to my hotel. Wow. Or he walked me until I could see my hotel. So really the people were very friendly. Just wonderful people, wonderful city, wonderful food.
Other than carpets, did you bring anything else back home?
I didn't bring any carpets back.
No?
I did bring back a suitcase full of things from Turkey that my host family had sent back with me, but a lot of handcrafted goods especially from Eastern Turkey. And, they would tell you if you want to buy something in Turkey, go to Gaziantep, which is where I have visited them, where things are made. Don't buy it in the Grand Bazaar. You'll spend half as much. So,
sure. Well, that's great. Thanks very much for your time, Chris.
You're welcome.
Thanks a lot again to Chris Christensen from the Amateur Traveler Podcast for being the guest on today's show. We're going to finish today's show with our Music for Airport Lounges feature, where we feature music from artists around the world who have made their music freely available on the PodSafe Music Network to be featured on podcasts. Today's song is from an artist by the name of Anne Young from Berlin in West Germany. She's influenced by things like Buddha Bar, Cafe Del Mar, and you're going to hear that a lot in this song that we're about to hear, which I think is very appropriate for today's show. The song is called Istanbul 7 a.m.
Thanks for listening to the Travel in 10 podcast. Please email any questions, comments, or suggestions you have to travelin10@gmail.com. This has been a presentation of Travel in 10.